Today on the Perception in Action podcast, Perception in Action Journal Club number 23. I'm joined by Mark Williams, Ed Cullen, Casey Critter, and Matt Shepard to talk about talent development. How can it be facilitated through coaching and practice design? What role does technology and analytics have to play? So it's time for a call to action. Hello, and thanks for joining me. This is Rob Gray from Arizona State University. I've been on a now over 25-year journey as a researcher, professor, and high-performance consultant to understand how we acquire and adapt our perceptual motor skills. Welcome to the Perception in Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. If you're a coach or an instructor, my goal is to help you bridge the gap between research and application, and to connect your experiential knowledge with skill acquisition and motor learning theory. I want to help take you from using practice design recipes to becoming a master chef who can manipulate the key ingredients to come up with your own innovative training methods. If you're a student or fellow academic working in the skill acquisition field, I hope to keep you up to date on the latest studies and help you get to know the people working in this area. Finally, if you're developing training technologies, I hope to help you incorporate good motor learning principles in your design, pull out key performance metrics from the data, and design effective studies to evaluate your product. To learn more, help support the podcast, and/or work directly with me, please check out perceptionaction.com. Now on to the show. In today's episode, we had a really fun discussion about talent development, building off Mark's new book, The Best: How Elite Athletes Are Made. Hope you enjoy. Okay, I think we're live. Welcome everyone to another edition of the Perception Action Journal Club. Today, I'm really happy to have a group here to talk about. Topic today is talent development. And this is kind of inspired by, I'm going to have everyone introduce themselves in a second, inspired by Mark's new book he has coming out soon called The Best: How Elite Athletes Are Made. So we're going to talk about talent development from a few different perspectives, practice design coaching, but also hopefully getting into a little bit of technology, how technology and new tools are supporting talent development in sports. So that's kind of the plan. And as usual, anyone that's following along, if you're on YouTube or Facebook, if you post a comment on those, I can see it, and I will happily post it to the group, the panel here, if we have time. So please do that. So to lead off, as I said, I want to let everyone introduce themselves. So I'll start with you, Mark, since you were kind of the inspiration for starting this. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
For sure. You've partly done so. Mark Williams, professor in kinesiology at the University of Utah. And thanks, Rob, for the invite to be on this broadcast.
Oh, you're welcome. Casey's next in my...
Casey Critter, volleyball coach at the University of Miami down in South Florida, and kind of like a little bit of a fanboy of Mark's work, of Ed's work, and developed some decent relationships with Rob and had a couple of good conversations with Mark. So, really honored to be included in this chat. I can't promise that I'm gonna change the world or anything, but fired up to be here with you guys.
Great, thanks. And the top right, we have Matt.
Hi, guys. My name is Matt Shepard. I'm the technical director of the Waterloo Minor Soccer Club, which is in Ontario in Canada. I've been there for about a year now, and I've had some experience too working in the professional game as a video analyst, as well as coaching women's pro teams as well. And I'm really looking forward to this too, and I've asked some people to send me some academic survival kits so I could not be completely embarrassed while I'm on here. So hopefully I manage that.
Yeah,
you and me both, Matt.
Yeah, you guys have to really use this stuff. We just talk about it. It's way easier. And in the middle, Ed.
Hi, Rob, and guys. Nice to meet you, Casey and Matt. Ed Cullen. I'm a skill acquisition specialist in the professional domain of elite athletes and working with especially professional golfers at the moment. And also my main job, my day job is a lecturer in skill acquisition in Cork Institute of Technology. I'm probably in the room because I'm one of the enormous Mark Williams stable. I did my PhD with Mark all those years ago in Liverpool, and it's still to this day a huge highlight of my life, but also of my career. So delighted to actually be on a chat with Mark, and also a bit like you guys. I know I'm also in the kind of space of I hope I don't intrude and mess things up here either.
Yeah.
I thought you were on the show, Ed, because you coached Tiger Woods at the Masters. You were maybe responsible for that 10 on the 12th. Anything to do with you?
I'll take it. I wasn't, but I'll take it because it was. What I'm delighted about my partnership with Tiger was his response after it, and the 5 birdies and 6 holes or whatever.
Yeah. Well, you may have noticed I put Bryson DeChambeau's name on the title of this, and because he's the kind of the current model of someone using science to prove. And of course, he went out in the Masters and completely bombed and ruined my story. So, oh well. To start off with, Mark, I thought I'd start with you and then get everyone's opinion. Kind of a general question. I think. So we looked at the kind of the last third part of your book, and one of the main messages you see in this, and I think you tried to emphasize, is kind of this changing role of a coach. You know, what their role is in athlete development. Can you talk a little bit about that and kind of what message you were trying to get across about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, maybe it might help if I give a little bit of context. You've already said the title of the book, The Best How Elite Athletes Are Made. We were joking prior to the start of this broadcast that I guess it is a reflection of 30 years of work that I've been involved in. And the book is actually split in 3 sections, very briefly. The first section talks about environmental influences and the development of expertise. So it looks at issues like where you're born, when you're born, that is the relative age effect, the role of siblings and family, talent identification, and the role of street sport. And then the middle section talks about some of the adaptations that occurs as a result of prolonged engagement in practice, for things like the development of game intelligence skills and some of the key psychological characteristics that are developed over a prolonged period of time. And it talks about how we avoid choking as elite athletes and things of that ilk. But the final section, coming back to your original question, really looks at the role of the coach and technology in the development of elite athletes. So it's the shortest section in the book, but for me, it's probably one of the most interesting ones. The first chapter looks at deliberate practice. You know, what is deliberate practice? How do we implement it in an applied coaching context? The second chapter looks a little bit more about, or discusses, if you like, synthesizes the more traditional work around model learning and highlights, I guess, the shift that has occurred over the last decade or two in turn generally amongst most coaches in many sports, is the shift from more hands-on to more hands-off approaches to instruction. And some of it is linked in, of course, to issues around the manipulation of constraints. But ultimately, it's about a less prescriptive, less coach-led approach to instruction with a greater emphasis on developing more independent and adaptive learners.
Yeah, no, I think it does a really good job of mixing that. Maybe can I get another Casey? Maybe I think you're living this, right? This changing role of the coach. Can you talk a little bit about, from your perspective, how things have changed?
Yeah. So I guess first I would say I'm always a little skeptical of popular books that try to simplify, I would argue, water down some of the scientific rigor of the work that you guys are doing. And Mark, I'm not just saying this because we're live or whatever. I think this is one of the few times that when I've read a text that's designed for a popular or a more mainstream audience, I felt that the integrity of the science, as I understand it, which is limited, obviously, but the integrity of the science was kept intact, and it felt like the one everyone talks about is outliers, right? And the 10,000 hour rule and how that went sideways. And I don't know. I would imagine your fingerprints are all over the day-to-day production of this book. And I wouldn't recommend a lot of popular books to people. I'd recommend this to any coach. And the section that we kind of spent the most time on, I think, reviewing, I'm a young coach, I'm only 31. And so this shift that you're talking about, I'm probably not experienced enough to observe, the 1960s, 70s, 80s, whatever. But I certainly, in my own career, I felt a bit of a shift where I thought my value as a coach for a long time was rooted in the knowledge that I had, and then obviously the second part is giving that knowledge to the athlete and kind of crafting them in my image, so to speak. And I found my job to be more enjoyable. Anecdotally, I found it to be more effective and productive to kind of reconceptualize the process with them at the center of it, and me as a supporting actor, so to speak. And we can get into I'm sure we'll get into the different sections of the book, but the theme that came up a bunch in each of these parts of the section that we read was just, as you touched on, coaches kind of reframing their role as a support staff, much in the same way that strength and conditioning, physiotherapist, stuff like that would be, and placing the athlete with some autonomy at the center of it. And I think it's just a really powerful, elegant model. And this does a good job, I think, of encapsulating it in an accessible way to the masses.
Yeah. Nice.
Well, thanks for your positive comments, Casey. I'm glad to say that I wasn't around too much in the 60s. Certainly not doing research on this topic. I didn't start until the 90s, I guess. But just to come back to Rob's specific question, and just to frame that question a little bit, I guess there are two overriding themes that come out of this particular section. One is this important differentiation between performance and learning, in that the notion is that when we take a coaching session, we can't directly observe learning. We have to infer that learning is taking place through changes in performance over time. So what we actually see is the performance of the athletes. And I guess historically, quite prescriptive approaches have been used, heavy on instruction, heavy on the use of demonstration, specific block practice, and heavy on feedback, because ultimately that leads to the best performance during practice. But of course, the paradox here is that often the reverse conditions promote better long-term learning, retention, and transfer of skills, which is, what is the least amount of information that we need to give athletes before they begin to practice the skill? To what extent are the practice conditions dynamic and variable in that they reflect the demands of competition? And what is the least amount of feedback they need to give the athlete? So clearly that shift towards a more hands-off approach, I think, better develops learning in athletes. So I think that differentiation between performance and learning is key. And again, I'd be interested to hear your observations on that. And then secondly, coming back to the deliberate practice issue, I think what deliberate practice does, or the concept of deliberate practice more than anything, it puts the focus onto the individual and the fact that maybe historically we've taken less account of individual differences in learning and how that's impacted by practice and instruction than might have ideally been the case. So for me, they're the key challenges for the coach. How do we ensure that every practice session constitutes deliberate practice for each and every learner in that session? And again, how do we get this balance right between performance and learning?
Yeah, no, I think there's some great points there. And I think maybe in a little bit, that's where technology can come in a bit, and identifying what you need to work on instead of just having this broad stroke that we give to everybody. But I wanted to pick up the deliberate practice a bit and maybe ask Ed, since I know you've done a lot in this area. One of the other things I see you, Mark, you emphasize this hands-off coaching, but you also importantly point out deliberate practice. What distinguishes it from what Anders called purposeful practice is still the coach, right? The coach has to be there giving, and I think the term you use is direct instruction to help with improvement. And one of the messages I got, and I know from talking to coaches, this is the big struggle now for coaches, finding this balance between hands-off, exploring, and when do I step in, right? And you talk about it being a sweet spot of instruction and implicit learning, balance between. Ed, can you talk a little bit about that, or some of the other issues if you want to touch on as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a key part. In fact, I just went back to some of the pages there in the book, and when you were talking, the one thing that jumped out of me around that section was the essence of coaching seems to be a more patient coach, to not feel the need to rush the athlete, like, as you know, more hands off, allow them time to explore around what they're doing, and not force your idea of what they should be doing onto them, let's say. And I think it reminds me of a quote I think you had, Rob, with a chat with Stu Armstrong, which was that error detection is the athlete's job, not the coach's job. So if we can actually get into that place where we're helping them we're helping them feel like they've got time on their hands to figure some of these things out. I think that's a big part of, and I think when you look at that section around Ella Deladonna and the basketball and her work with her coach, Eric Thibault, it's all about him giving her maybe some tasks to do. So he was very much a part of developing the tasks. He was very much a part of designing the practice based around the stats and so on and so forth, but then also giving her time and space to live it, to be in that space, to figure out what works for her, or how she needs to engage or not, as the case may be. But it was always, again, going back to Mark's point, it was always leading to somewhere, to that performance space, you know. And they were never, you almost got a sense that there was this patience in the practice environment, because they know, well, this is just practice. We won't know whether this is working until we actually get into the performance space. And I think that's something, again, even going back through the pages of the book, there is that sense of this. If there is such a thing as this new emergent way of us talking about coaching, it is for coaches to just maybe be more patient, and to not have this finger on the button all the time, foot in the accelerator all the time, because we've got to get this done, because and now that it's done, great, that's working. That's just not the case in practice.
No, I some great points there, Ed, but picking up on that, I guess, whilst your comments talk about the importance, therefore, of better educating coaches, there's also a need, of course, to better educate parents here, who, usually tend to prefer a more structured and prescriptive approach to coaching. And maybe to some degree, again, some players, of course, might prefer that approach as well, because of this focus maybe too much on performance rather than long-term learning and development. So I think there's probably a need for education across the board, isn't it? Better education for coaches, athletes, which fits in with the notion of engaging the athletes more in the learning and instruction process, and of course, parents.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think even on that, let's say within deliberate practice, if it comes back again to those kind of open conversations, if an athlete is aware that, okay, we've identified a weakness in your performance, there's a rate limiting factor in your performance. Okay, so if you can appreciate that it's going to be tough, it's going to be effortful, it's not immediately rewarding, it's not inherently enjoyable. If you can prepare yourself for that, that may help through those tougher times from a motivational perspective and so on and so forth. But equally, like you were saying, if the parents can have an appreciation of that as well. So it is to try and open up those lines of communication. But again, it comes back to the expectation. Deliberate practice is challenging. It is that place where we're asking an athlete to go to the area of their game that they've probably neglected the most. If they hadn't, well, it wouldn't be such a weakness. It wouldn't be such a rate limiting factor. And I think the more they have, maybe the more they're primed for maybe the expectation of, well, this is going to be harder. So okay, get ready for the hard stuff, let's say. The more I think there's going to be greater buy-in for it.
Yeah, Matt, what are your thoughts on kind of these issues?
Yeah, well, just to follow on from the two most recent points, I think in my journey as a coach educator now, and technical director looking after the whole club, I think the biggest gains we're looking to make, or I'm looking to make, is in the area of parent education. We've got an online platform now, for instance, with mental training. Some of you may have heard of it's Dan Abrams Academy. So we're looking to, and a key part of that is actually getting parents to understand what's going on the field and in the classroom with their coaches, and to be able to better support that. But along those lines is to follow up in other areas to try and help give parents the tools that they need to better support in the area of skill acquisition or nutrition or whatever it is, even sleep and things like that. Some of the things that were really well documented in Mark's book. So I think for me, that's the next frontier. If we can get that third pillar of the player development sort of pyramid in a better place, and I think it's going to help the experience of the players, which is what we're here for.
Yeah, I think that's really good points. And I wanted to pick up something, Mark. So I think in one of the issues I see with this confusion about this is that there's two ways to coach: this hands-on way with instruction, and hands-off with no instruction. So some people conflate instruction with prescription, I think. So when you say, Mark, when you say direct instruction in terms of deliberate practice, is that, I'm assuming that's not just prescription. You're talking about more, because the example you give in the basketball example, so the basketball example is a player that's going left too much shooting. Mm-hmm. Right. The example used to affect that is a constraints-led approach. It's not instruction at all. Right. The coach is playing against her and making her go the other way, which is a constraint. So can you talk a little bit about this tension with this instruction, if you understand what I'm asking?
Yeah, although I guess you could argue that a constraint is a form of instruction.
Exactly.
As well, in that it shapes the learning environment to a large extent. Mm-hmm. Lost my thread a little bit there in terms of what were the points that we're going to make. I suppose there is a little bit of confusion in the literature at one side, I guess, in that there is a large body of research that highlights the benefits of more implicit forms of instruction and learning, like external focus of attention and using guided discovery learning approaches, which in essence minimize the cognitive engagement of the learner in the process of practice, whereas I guess the contrast in part is that deliberate practice is a process that is very cognitively engaged from the learner's perspective. And having debated this with coaches a little bit, I mean, maybe the notion is that the deliberateness comes in at more of an intentional level in regards to, what specifically do you need to work on and how might you work on it, as opposed to the more procedural aspects of actually performing the skill, if that makes sense. Because I've thought about that issue quite a bit, and it is a very interesting one in many ways.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great example, Mark. And I think you give another really good example. I think it's a soccer example where they're assigning points for if you shoot at this side, you get 10 points, this side, you get 5. So you're using an instruction, a constraint to change intention, not as a way to tell them how to do it. So I think that's really good. Matt, I wanted to pick. Sorry, Mark. Go.
Sorry, I was just going to say, Rob, that I did engage Anders quite a bit in terms of writing that particular chapter. And Anders and I, were friends for 20 odd years, and obviously, sadly, as probably most of your listeners will know, he passed away earlier this year. Which was a great loss because I used to love my conversations with Anders, and certainly liked his philosophical approach to science, and has probably one of the most stimulating intellects, if not the most stimulating, that I've probably met in my career. But even then, the more back and forth we went, to some degree, I was getting confused around the differentiation between deliberate practice and purposeful practice. For instance, and Anders obviously argued that deliberate practice, the presence of a coach was quite instrumental, whereas in purposeful practice, the coach might not be present. But obviously, there's quite a lot of research now that also highlights the fact that learners, through, for instance, street sport, can learn a lot independent of there being input from a coach. So we had a lot of debate around those issues. I mean, irrespective of what terminology you use and what your perceptions on them, the things that come out as being most important for me out of Anders' work actually is firstly the focus on the individualized nature of practice, in the sense that athletes have different strengths and weaknesses, and clearly what you need to do is design practice to work on the relevant weaknesses of each athlete, which has probably been a little bit contrast to a lot of our traditional experimental model learning work over the years, which has been all about groups. So I think the focus on the individual is important. And I think the focus on Ed spoke about it around challenge points and the notion of desirable difficulties of creating an appropriate challenge so that learners develop from that point on these areas that may be perceived as weaknesses. So for me, irrespective of the terminology, or even irrespective of whether the coach is present or not, those concepts around individualized nature of learning, challenge points, desirable difficulties are some of the key things that probably emerge from that body of work.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think, there's been a back and forth about the details of the definitions, but the central messages, I think, are still people remain. Matt, I wanted to ask you a little bit about some of these issues, and in the instruction versus letting them play issue. This is something I come across. I'm sure in soccer, you design a small-sided game with kids too. They're not passing. They don't know how to pass. What do? Do you step in and tell them? Right? It's a very hard challenge. Do you have some kind of thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, across the whole spectrum of skills, really, it's tough now because, for instance, looking at some of the work from Renshaw and Davids, they're talking about, forgive me, it's coordination and versus that adaptability. So in terms of coordination, when is someone coordinated enough to be able to then go on to other things, I guess, and do some of those approaches, like even looking at what they're talking about with La Masia and discovery learning and things like that. With the 7 and 8 year olds I see I'm working with on the field, what's the role of the coach then in providing some examples? Like Mark, you didn't see this part of your book, but in terms of street ball and learning from models, learning, like Brazilian kids learning in the favelas, I'm sure they've seen examples of good play. So now is it not the coach's role to provide examples of good play? Like you hear these things, don't teach them how to do a scissors, don't teach them how to do a step over. Well, I guess, but can you show them, and can you maybe give them some inspiration to do it? In terms of spreading out, can you not show them how to spread out and see if they learn from it and adapt from it? I guess it's just finding that balance and there being no absolutes, and also recognizing it's a continuum of learning. And once they've reached that challenge point where they can have some success, and now they can start to discover for themselves, or you start to free up the boundaries, I guess.
Yeah, Ed or Kate?
Sorry, I mean, I think
go ahead, Mark.
Great points there, isn't there? That all links into this differentiation again between performance and learning, and the pros and cons of being more and less hands-off or hands-on. And ultimately, there's a lot of craft knowledge that's involved in that process in terms of deciding when to progress or when not to progress, and how to provide different levels of instruction, manipulate constraints in certain ways. And for fear of opening up a can of worms here to some degree, I think whilst I'm a strong proponent of constraints-based approaches to instruction, I think it is probably worth noting two areas of concern here, in the sense that, firstly, it depends on the level of the kids that you're working with. So if you're working with kids that demonstrate some element of potential and ability and are looking to progress to the next level, then I think a constraints-based approach is probably necessary so that they make the key adaptations that are needed to develop to the next stage of learning. But ultimately, and this is very much a problem at your end, potentially, and I don't know what level of the kids you're working with, but if the kids want to come, learn some skills, have fun, develop some interest in the sport that allows them to engage in physical activity over a long period of time, then maybe there may be some advantages to a very prescriptive approach to coaching. So to some degree, I guess maybe the nature of your coaching needs to reflect the level of the kids and the aspiration of the kids as far as development is concerned. And then my second point on the constraints-based learning, of course, is that a misnomer by and large is that with the constraints-based approach that you can just chuck the kids the ball and let them play. But, that isn't the case. And to some degree, to be able to coach through the process of manipulating constraints is an exceptionally difficult thing to do, because as a coach, you need to know the game so well that if you change this constraint or that constraint, how will behavior change? Otherwise, it just becomes a process of just random manipulations to practice to some degree. And of course, the problem is that there aren't any recipe books here. There aren't any clear guidebooks that allow you to go, how do you change constraints and what constraint do you change in the here and now? And that's where this craft knowledge and intuition of the coach comes in. Mm-hmm. So maybe I've opened a couple of can of worms.
No.
Interesting points of discussion.
I think they're fair. They're fair point, definitely, Mark. And the books are coming. There's actually one on golf, right? That just came out, and there's soccer. Okay. Yeah, some good examples. Ed or Casey, what are your kind of thoughts on this? There's some really good points. Mark. Those are excellent points. How do you give the kids the fundamentals? That was kind of questions.
If you don't mind, Casey, I'll jump in first. And it's because something came from what Matt said earlier, and then what Mark followed up with. I'm in a lovely position. I coach as a job, but I also am a dad. So I also jump in at the under 13s and the under 9s, and so it's 8-year-olds and 12-year-olds, and it's football. And in other sports, but this is the ones that I mainly go in at, and I'm very I'm a strong advocate of the constraints approach. I also agree with Mark. It's very difficult. I think we need to again there's a priming that's required here in coach education, because I think if people are just told I should just change that and we'll find, then you can just step back and it'll all just happen in front of you. It's such a misleading message to give to people, because it's very challenging to be able to coach in that way. However, having said that when I see, and again with under 13s and under 9s, there's a vast array of ability in front of us. And you were speaking there around what they're capable of. Well, these action capabilities that we talk about. Well, some will be able to do some things sooner, and then others, and some people will be significantly far behind, especially at the younger ages, for all the reasons that Mark mentioned earlier. Because my youngest boy, he's out in the green outside our house playing with boys 4, 5, 6 years older than him, because his big brother's out there. His older brother would never in a million years been out there, because he was an only child for the first few years of his life. And there's no way we would have let him out there with older boys and kids. And yet, so when my 8-year-old goes to football and he's playing with his peers, it's like he's like this incredibly capable kid, because they're all his own size, and he doesn't get knocked off the ball and so on and so forth. But what I'm getting to here is just around use of the constraints, let's say, is that I believe the challenge point theory put forward by Guadagnoli and Lee is something that can have a big part to play in the constraints. Because let's say if I'm doing even work around dimensions and I want the kids to go into 5v5 in a large space or a medium-sized space or a small space, I will be able to identify where their action capabilities are better suited. So maybe there's a kid, let's say, in the normal environment, in the normal space, is out of their depth. But when I put them into a different dimension space, they find some action capabilities there, because maybe they are able, the ball is closer to them more often than not, and so on and so forth. And that's where I think it can be very useful in that space to help coaches identify where kids are at and still be able to have all the kids engaged in game-related, representative learning design and all that kind of stuff, in game-related tasks, without going down the more prescriptive, repetitive, drill-oriented tasks. Because I think, for example, a normal 5v5 of that age group in a 30 by 30 square, yes, some kids are going to seriously struggle in that, and the better kids will be quite good because they'll be able to identify space and so on. But if I bring those same 5v5 into a 15 by 15, all of a sudden you're a lot closer to the ball more often. And all of a sudden the action capabilities gets leveled off a little bit more. That's even before I put rules into the game, And And that's why I think it's an encouraging way. And again, the reason I say this is I've been coaching for years. And so I coached the way I was coached. And it was drill oriented. It was very prescriptive. It was directive coaching. And now the way I coach is yes, it's very different. And it is much more engaged around their experience. I'm now coaching to their experience rather than coaching, as you said, Casey, for them to have a likeness of what I think they should look like, you know?
Casey or Matt, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, there's something that Mark said that really resonated with me, and Ed, you touched on it a little bit, and it's almost this idea that from a coach education standpoint, the barrier for entry to a more ecological or constraints-based approach is really high, and I think it's because we have a much better capability generally to understand the mechanisms of our sport as opposed to the context of it. And it's easy for us to look and go, Steph Curry shoots like this and Wayne Gretzky skates like this. And it's much tougher to understand those mechanisms or mechanics or techniques or whatever you'd want to call them. From the perspective of them being directly linked or corresponding to the environmental factors and the organismic constraints. And so I think to Ed's point, and a little bit to Mark's point, this understanding of the sport, and I would argue the understanding of the context of the sport performance is a challenge. And for me, I know this transition, if there's such a thing, or this awareness of and effort to understand and implement a more constraints-led approach started about 3 years ago. And for the majority of that so far, I felt extremely unstable in terms of my ability, my understanding. 3 or 4 years ago, I thought I was, the next Olympic gold medal winning coach in Tokyo. I'm not. So, but I think going through this process of having to assess our sport and our athletes and the context, the relationships that exist there is really destabilizing. And so I think one of the things that's a challenge for coach educators, which I am not at all. So Matt, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, but is there's a really high barrier for entry. Every time I broach this topic with people who maybe take a little bit more prescriptive approach or what I would call a traditional approach, and even if there's genuine interest, there takes this kind of resilience to be able to grind through this state of instability that could last a long time, understanding how to manipulate constraints and resisting the urge to jump in and just say, hey, do it like this. And so I think that's one of the challenges of that you've acknowledged, Mark, of this entire approach to coaching is that it's a really, I don't want to say complicated, but complex process, learning how to get good at it.
Yeah. I mean, I can probably, let me make a couple of points there. I mean, I guess as someone who's been involved and continues to be involved in coach education for a number of years, I guess, I think what we probably need is more opportunity for coaches and maybe people with a skill acquisition background to interact in a more continuous manner, in so much as that, I often turn up and I might give an hour session and then that's it. I don't see the coaches again. Whereas I think, as you're articulating there, more discussion and dialogue around, well, what does this actually mean, and how would we, how would this work in context and in principle, is probably where more the dialogue might go. And just as a side issue, and again, this is my personal view, but I don't link this notion of constraint into any particular theoretical framework. Ultimately, it's a tool. It's a coaching tool. And you could argue that the notion of constraints is not really theoretical framework. It's a descriptive framework that coaches can use as tools within the coaching setting. So to some degree, and in fact, part of the problem here perhaps is that there is an argument that suggests that maybe transition of these tools into the coaching environment is not helped a little bit by the psychobabble that follows a lot of this debate and some of the terminology and the flowery language that is used. Maybe at times that might be less helpful than one might think.
Yeah, well, that's a very common feedback, Mark. I get. Matt, what's your experience been like as an educator? Kind of, people adopting more hands-off approach and working with coaches.
Well, first I'd just say, Mark, so you're not a fan of perturbations, then?
Well, I suppose they can be useful in some contexts, but I don't know. I mean, I remember having a debate with Keith Davids. I haven't seen Keith for a while now, but certainly when I was a postgraduate and talking to Keith, he was a strong believer in the fact that coaches need a guiding theoretical framework. And I guess perhaps I'm a little bit more pragmatic. I'm certainly more of an empiricist, but my view was really, I'm not sure they need a framework. I just think they need to know what to do in any given context or situation. You can say that might be guided by theory, but I think it's grasping the main concepts of how you apply the things that might be difficult with some of the terminology that's used.
Yeah, I think part of the challenge is like there is a lot of, as you say, language going around, and even the idea of representativeness. So now if you want to try and scaffold something for players and it doesn't exactly happen in a certain part of the field, it's wrong or maybe it's frowned upon. But for me, it's like, well, can you use that tool for part of a session? And then maybe over time, it's completely based in where it happens in the field, and maybe there's more complexity to it. And because even if I look at something like a 1v1 situation, sometimes a 1v1, just having two players go at each other is more complex than having a 2v1, because now you've got the option of playing to somebody and using the disguise of playing to somebody. So there's a lot in it to unpack, and I think sometimes the challenge is to get into that level of detail, I guess, which sometimes takes years to develop that craft, as you mentioned, Mark. And so it's just hard to really teach that in a way.
Yeah, no, good points. And I won't take the debate to go down that rabbit hole about theory, the importance of theory. I'm trying to work on that.
That's a different conversation.
Yeah. So, but what I wanted to do, I wanted to switch a little bit to talking about kind of technology and analytics, because I think the last part of your book, I think you called The New Frontier, which is really one of the things I really liked about it, Mark, is oftentimes when we talk about analytics in particular for a coach, it's all about strategy and game planning. What formation should I run? And I really like your book. You emphasize how you can use analytics for practice design. And I think that really goes back to Anders' point, right? You can use analytics to identify what athletes need to work on. It's another tool other than just observation and stuff. You can, that the basketball example you give is a great one. The person's going left too often and they're not being deceptive. You never know that probably. Analytics makes it easier now to identify these. Can you talk a little bit about that, using those things as a coaching tool, for practice design?
Yeah, I mean, fundamental to the concept of deliberate practice is, of course, the fact that we can measure performance and as objectively as possible and identify what may be working well and what may not be working so well. And that, in essence, then you can design practices that try and improve performance on those tasks. So clearly measurement is an integral part of that. And I like that approach as well. I mean, I suppose the question might be, to what extent is that approach actually used that much in training, in the sense of, how many of the big four sports in the US are using data analytics in that way to kind of identify strengths and weaknesses in players that then subsequently guides training and instruction. I mean, as you said, there's a couple of good examples in the book, but I'm not sure how widespread that kind of empirically driven approach to practice is across the board.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's an opportunity. Ed, did you, now that we can measure so many things, how are you using that? Thinking about using that? Yeah.
Well, I think one of the first things I always think of when around stats and sports is baseball. I love it, and yet I still don't know much about it. But I'll always say, John, I'll watch it because I'm just one of those sports fans. I love it. I love so much about it. But I also am stunned when I even talk to people like you, Rob, and others like even Martin Niehoff and the boys in the Netherlands and stuff. How oftentimes when they talk about how resilient some cultural beliefs are still in baseball, and yet they've so much data that they are able to acquire from the games, and that's one of the things for me is fascinating in that area. And I don't know that much about sport, but I'm like, for all the data that they have, and yet when I speak to anybody in baseball, they're always kind of banging their head against the wall saying, yes, and yes, you should see how they still practice. It's still so repetitive and overly repetitive. And you know what I mean? So I don't know how much, like Mark said, I don't know how much of it is actually getting through.
Yeah, well, certainly I've had some discussions with teams from, all the big four American sports, American football, basketball, baseball, and ice hockey. And the general perception is that it's still a very traditional and very prescriptive approach to practice. And I think probably part of that issue is that, to my knowledge, I don't think any of those big four sports have a formal coach education process. And possibly sports science as an applied discipline, certainly coming from the academic domain, is less well developed in the US. The focus, of course, is more about kinesiology with a stronger focus on health. So probably you have less coaches that are going into the coach education system, where a coach education system exists, that are coming from a sport or a coaching science background. So maybe to some degree, certainly in some sports, I think actually there are some other sports that are quite innovative in the US. US soccer is actually quite good. They've got a good coach education system. I think volleyball is good. But certainly by and large, I would say that in Europe and in the UK, the sports science and the coach education structures are better integrated and more well developed, which I think then helps change practice on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, that's a good. I can speak to the baseball. It's kind of an interesting story there. There's a good book if you're interested in Mark's book. There's a good baseball-specific book called The MVP Machine. Baseball has been really adopting this, but it's like you say, Mark. It actually came from outside the actual professional realm. There, in particular, there was a company called Driveline Baseball, a private company in Seattle that started collecting data on individual players and focusing on training those things. Now it's kind of spun up into the major leagues, but it started outside. It was right. There wasn't much, but that the same kind of principles have happened. Okay, Casey, can you talk a little bit about kind of volleyball? Are you start using data in coaching or things like that?
Yeah, we I think we're pretty fortunate in a kind of globally in our sport, but there's a really concerted effort to incorporate analytics. Maybe a little bit less. We're kind of catching up on the wearable technology, that sort of thing. There's not a lot in VR yet, but the analytics. There's a couple groups of people. We actually, in our setting, the NCAA, we have a company that will code every action of every match that we have on video. They'll codify it and make it easily accessible via a web portal to our athletes, our staff, and anyone who played in the match. And they do that at the professional level in Europe, all over the world. And they produce reports that are what I would consider certainly above my pay grade in terms of producing them or understanding them. But it's a big piece. And certainly in our country, I think Brazil, Italy, there's a really big push to incorporate analytics. And sometimes I think where we get lost in our sport is under kind of what I would call going halfway in the sense that we get really good at writing formulas and algorithms to understand information and parse it out in hyper specific ways. And then we kind of just say, hey, look at this, as opposed to kind of finishing it, in my opinion, would be understanding what that means for application. And we're really good at producing numbers And one of the things that's happened probably just over the last 5 or 6 years is you're starting to see, at least at the collegiate level, I think it's happened a little bit more at the international level, but at the collegiate level, you're starting to see these, what we call technical coordinators, basically analytics people. They're starting to get really integrated into coaching decisions, whether it's tactical, but even training. And they're producing reports. They're starting to be included in terms of understanding some of the underlying principles of skill development, whatever they may be for that particular program. And that's a really exciting space, I think, for our sport right now, because that integration, I think it's going to kind of finish this process of just producing numbers in really fascinating ways into actually having some tangible benefit consistently from a game planning perspective, from a practice design perspective, from a health perspective, all sorts of stuff like that. But our sports, we're really fortunate, I think, and headed in the right direction.
Yeah, I agree, Casey. I think that's the missing piece. How to use these things and give them to the player. And I know you talk about this in the book, Mark. I think you caution about this, the analytics, the measurables, I gave the example of the golfer standing in front of a launch monitor and can get all this data. You talk about the principles we know about feedback, how much. And so can you talk a little bit about that? There's a potential danger of all this stuff too, the chasing measurables, things like that. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, as you're highlighting there is, in keeping with the guidance hypothesis, this notion that if you provide too much feedback, explicit feedback or augmented feedback from the coach during the learning process, then the learner becomes dependent on that. So that when it's not available during competition, then performance is negatively impacted. So, that's part of that debate again, isn't it? In terms of, what information to provide, when to provide it, and not, accepting the fact that data analytics are going to be crucial. There is still a real challenge there about how do we use that data in the optimal manner to facilitate skill learning. And there's certainly, whilst there's a lot of sort of traditional experimental research work around feedback provision, there still isn't a lot of very applied research in field settings that, look at the effectiveness of these types of interventions over time, which is probably where we need to go. Mm-hmm. But, sometimes more is not necessarily better, I guess, is also the analogy here.
Yeah, definitely. Matt, what are your thoughts kind of on tech and soccer, kind of technology, analytics, how you're using those things?
Yeah, I think I've seen it used at different levels. I was lucky enough to go to Seattle for a couple of weeks. I had a friend there and just see the way they're implementing data there. And if I was to step down to the next level, where I was a couple of years ago at Cavalry FC in the Canadian Premier League, some of the same processes in place. And now I'm at this level, which is another level below with working with younger players. I'm trying to apply some of those processes even within our academy, for predominantly in terms of feedback. There's a system we're looking to implement from Denmark where coaches can give feedback to players and answer questions as well in a more regular basis. Allow players to code their own games and that kind of thing. And I think the big question I've got out of all this is, will there be some information or data we could use and maybe use for research down the road, and maybe shape it a bit that way? So I think we're taking our toddler steps with this really at the moment and just seeing how we could use it. But I think there's obviously a lot of tech and innovation going on in different sports and especially in soccer as well. So looking to see how we can filter that down and use it in an applied way.
Yeah, no, I think it's really.
If I may,
go ahead.
I think I see it a lot in the golf at the moment. And I'm wondering how much does the media play a part in a lot of this? Because like in golf, you mentioned the launch monitor. I know we mentioned Bryson DeChambeau before this chat and stuff, and you look at golf. Huge amounts of data now. Even live on the screen, we see club head speed, ball speed, the peak angle of the peak trajectory, and so on and so forth, and carry distance and all this. And yet, there are some of the best coaches on the tour, across the tours, are people who engage so much more around the games of the game, the sport. So, Dustin Johnson's coach, Claude Harmon III, his coaching is fascinating for how it's all just a manipulation of scenarios that Dustin's got to survive. He also worked with Brooks Copper for years, who now is with Butch Harmon and Cameron McCormick with Jordan Smith. These are all guys. Yes, they use the data, but it's a tiny slice of what they do from a coaching perspective. But there's big business out there who are trying to sell it to the 15 handicappers, to the that you need this stuff. And yet the pros, the pros have become exceptional at knowing when to use it and when, and even in your book, Mark, you speak about it with Phil Kenyon, who's one of the world's leading putting coaches out there. And yet, if you even see any of the work that he does and hear about the stuff he mentions in his own work, there's massive. It's all about scenario-based work. Yes, does he have the equipment and the tools and the kit to use? He does, but it's a really small part of what he does as a coach. Because as a coach, he's just all about the connection with the athlete, trying to find out who they are, trying to get to the nuts and bolts of what they're like under pressure, that performance element again, and then just creating multiples of scenarios to see how do they cope with them. Where there's very hard to get data on that kind of stuff. And yet, this is where a lot of the coaching happens. And I sometimes wonder, does the media skew it hugely, from what actually...
I think it's probably fair to say across the board, actually, that technology, is playing an increasing part in the development of elite athletes. But I think maybe what sometimes lags behind is how the technology is integrated with the instructional systems design aspect of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think more work is needed to better harness this technology, whether it's feedback, whether it's virtual reality, around some of these broad concepts around, how do we design and deliver effective practice sessions? Because technology on its own really isn't the solution.
Yeah. No, it's a tool you can use to implement good practice design. Right. I think we have just a few minutes left here. Mark, I just wanted to bring it back around to deliberate practice. And I think a really nice message you have in the book is, the idea that being an elite is not reaching this level of automaticity, then setting it on autopilot. It's you bringing in, I think, Andrew's phrase, preventing arrested development, right? It's an active, keep making yourself and keep developing, whether it's with technology or any of the other tools we talked about today. I know that seems to be a main message you're trying to get across, right? And there's always room to grow and improve, and
Yeah, very much so. And that was one of the key findings actually out of Ed's PhD thesis in terms of this notion that expert athletes, skilled athletes are more likely to practice skills that aren't necessarily the strongest skills, whereas in contrast, those at a slightly less level are more likely to practice things that they're already good at. So I guess avoiding this plateau of arrested development and continuing to set desirable difficulties or appropriate challenge points to stress the system, embraced within this, or surrounded by this concept of specificity, is, I think, for me, one of the key notions about skill development, driven by coaches and by those with a skill acquisition background, like Ed.
Yeah. No, I think it's a great thing. So we got to wrap it up here. We got meetings after, but thanks, guys. That was really fun. So, Mark, it's how the bet. No, sorry, I'm losing the name of the book. When is it coming? There it is. The best. How elite athletes are made. When is it? It's out soon, right, Mark?
Yeah, it's actually coming out in the US on the 1st of December.
Okay, good Christmas present.
Out here in the rest of the world since the summer, but I guess they're making you guys on that side of the Atlantic wait a little bit longer. So it should be out in a couple of weeks or so.
Yeah. No, I think like we were saying earlier, I think if it's a good gap in the market of, if you want someone to understand what we mean by variability of practice, this is a way more accessible way and implicit learning and all these concepts, because it gives it lots of examples, understandable examples from teams and players. So instead of reading a textbook, so I like that aspect of it.
And I think as Casey really accurately said, it stays true to the evidence. Other books have gone in the past, and they've been great books, but they didn't see that the evidence was good enough just to present the evidence. They kind of had to embellish it a bit. This book does not embellish the evidence. It presents the evidence and then provides some real life stories with it, which is just why I kind of like it, to be honest.
So thanks, everyone. That was a lot of fun. Went by fast. And thanks for everyone that followed along. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled.
Straight away.